Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. With so much propaganda going on regarding the U.S.-China trade talks, and I guess there aren't talks yet, but the trade war and everything Donald Trump is saying about how he knows that China is about to bend the knee and call him back. I thought it would be a perfect time to speak with an expert on the subject matter, none other than Dr. John Gong, who's a professor of economics and vice president of research and strategy at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing, specializing in these sorts of subjects: finance, economics, industrial organization, and competition policies. We are going to get into everything today. So, Doctor, thank you for joining me. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much for the invitation, Jackson. It's great to be on your show, and I love to be engaged in this conversation about a very important topic as we move forward.
Well, it's an honor to have you here. What are your thoughts about this trade war thus far? Do you think it's hurting the United States? Do you think it's hurting China? Were you surprised by this?
Well, first of all, it is indeed a war, I think. And I think you exactly used the right word. It's economic war. I first want to spend a few minutes to talk about, what the Trump administration is coming from. I think with respect to China, there are two issues here. One, of course, is that Donald Trump he wants to eviscerate and upend the entire, so-called rules-based international order in the economic sphere, with the WTO at its core. I think he buys very much into his previous USTR, Robert Lighthizer, view that this whole system is totally against the United States. United States has been ripped off by many countries, friends and foes alike. For the last 30, 40 years, the system is totally against it. So it wants to entirely take it down, basically. Now, with respect to China, there's an additional layer of problem that the issue we're talking about here, that I just talked about a minute ago, is amplified by what's happened in China in the last 30 years. You look at the bilateral trade between the United States and China. It's close to a $400 billion deficit a year, about that. China exports about $400 billion, $500 billion to the United States. Now, this is trading goods, okay? The actual deficit, the actual surplus enjoyed by China, I would argue it's greatly mitigated for several reasons. First of all, if you look at the service trade, the United States enjoys I think it's over $100 billion of surplus in trading services. So that's mitigated by a lot by that, right? The second reason is that, in economics, it's actually a little bit of a subtle issue. It's not so much about what is the value of the goods crossing the customs that counts. It's what is really the value added that's counting as wealth, accrued to a particular country. So in this case, even though we export, for example, a perfect example is an iPhone assembled in China, export to the United States. Right? It's at the customs, they will probably value this at $400, but the value added created out of the iPhone in China is way less than $400, maybe 10%, 20% of that. So the custom data essentially twists the picture, the real value added created in China. So I think that's another issue that has been mitigating so-called, China ripping off the United States, right? The third issue is that about 1/3 of the trade exports coming from China to the United States are actually associated with American companies operating in China. So in other words, the so-called ripping off America, this money is actually accruing to American companies operating in China. It's going back to the Americans essentially, right? So, this whole argument is totally bogus in my view. I can get into real depth about why that's the case, but nevertheless, I'll just talk about these 3 points that the trade, so-called one-sided, lopsided trade. It's not that severe in my view. But anyway, that's another layer of problem that Donald Trump wants to rectify. I think, there's this issue about China has risen to a level that is starting to challenge the United States, not so much Beijing intentionally challenging us, but challenge in the sense that has a bigger GDP by purchasing power parity calculation. It advances greatly in technological fronts, in defense, for example. All these things are viewed as challenges from Washington's perspective. And they think that the reason China has reached to that stage is the stupidity of the previous presidents, as Donald Trump has been talking about this. So the American policy with respect to China has been totally wrong for the last 40 years, and it has reached such a level, and now it has to take action. So, this is a very typical American psyche in my view. I've lived in the United States for many years, so I have a better understanding of this sort of a psychological thinking behind this. It's not so much that Beijing is starting to challenge Washington. It's the perspective. It's the potential. It's the future possibility. It's the theoretical possibility that Beijing one day will be able to challenge Washington. That is making politicians in Washington very, very nervous these days. And that's actually driving America's policy towards China right now. They want to decouple, at least in technology products concerning national security. And hopefully they hope that they can slow China's growth down and essentially postpone the kind of a scenario, the arrival of the kind of a scenario I just talked about. That's basically what Washington's coming from, in my view.
I agree with you that Trump's claims that this is all because America has been ripped off is a bunch of fake news, as Trump likes to say. But he made these claims when he was running for president, and so he has to stick by them and do something about it. And it's this trade war that's not just limited to China. Right. But how would you say it has, in the short term at least, impacted China? Do people feel a difference? Has it impacted the economic outlook at all? Are there big political calculations that are being made right now surrounding what is going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, a trade war like this hurts both sides, definitely. I think, we understand very well that the United States, in America, price is starting to go up. And I think, the executives of the big retail companies have gone to Washington telling Donald Trump that in a few more weeks, the shelves will be empty at Walmart, at Target, at Macy's. This is a very scary scenario for Donald Trump. I think that definitely has political implications for him. Now, on the China side, of course, there are hundreds of companies engaged in exports to the United States are in big trouble. I mean, they're laying off people. I've seen some rough numbers, something like a few million jobs are being affected. But I think in China right now, at the entire society level, that kind of a pain on a part of individual companies, on a part of a few million employees engaged in Sino-US trade, haven't been really felt by the entire society. It hasn't, created this sort of a market sentiment that the economy is in big trouble. But if you think about the scale of this, it's still very small. And I would say it's even less than 1% of China's GDP. If the entire exports to the United States is gone. So I think definitely there are people feeling the pain right now, but that hasn't spilled over into the entire society to the extent that it creates sort of a market scare that something bad about the economy is going to happen. If you go to the shopping malls in Beijing, we just came, from the Labor Day long weekend. The statistics are showing great. People are traveling. The hotels are booked. People are spending money. So I think at this point, it hasn't really affected the entire society yet. And of course, I think the Chinese government is taking very careful policies and measures to make sure that it doesn't create sort of a stampede kind of a thing, right? It doesn't want this feeling to be totally promulgated into the entire society. That's not happening right now.
How do you think Donald Trump is viewing this? Because he keeps talking about how, President Xi Jinping is going to come around, bend the knee. He's going to talk to me. He's going to talk to me. Maybe there's some movement happening. I don't know. I've seen some indications of that, but I think this is definitely not the response that he expected. He maybe expected China to come running to him the moment these tariffs were implemented, but that hasn't been the case.
Well, I would start. I would address your questions starting from the very day one that spreadsheet was introduced. This ridiculous formula of calculating tariffs for over 100 countries. Yeah. Clearly, this thing is not well prepared. It hasn't thought about the consequences of this. It hasn't thought about what if these countries are not bending their knees. It hasn't thought about what is the plan B. It hasn't talked about what's the next step. I mean, they just came up with this ridiculous formula, thinking that the rest of the world will bend their knee and in Donald Trump's words, kiss his ass. Right? But China's very different. China's never going to do that. And I think even countries like Japan is taking a step back and showing a sort of a much stronger position right now. So I think one evidence that I can point to support my theory is that, you look at what happened to Peter Navarro. I mean, this formula came from Peter Navarro. He is being sidelined, essentially, right? This thing's supposed to be in the hands of the Secretary of Commerce, USTR, Trade Advisor. All three of them are gone now. I mean, not gone, but in the sideline for this matter. It's now Scott Bessent is actually taking over. Who is he? He's the Secretary of Treasury, right? He is steering the wheel of this negotiation. So I think, from that perspective, it's very clear that the original planners, strategists, the products are being sidelined right now. They're not taking the wheel. So I think Bessent has another agenda in my view. I think he doesn't probably buy into this whole theory that the entire international order needs to be taken down. He's more of in my view, he's more of the Biden camp that, this is all about China. We need to establish an alliance against China. I think he's probably taking more of that kind of attitude. But this is actually very different from the original vision that Donald Trump had when he started this trade war. So I think, he talks about, this all planned. That's all bogus in my view. Yes, they've been adjusting their strategy along the way up to this point. And I think Bessent said it very clearly. The pending discussion with China's Vice Premier, Mr. He, in Switzerland, I think over this weekend, is about resuming trade first. Right now at this very high tariff levels, clearly it's an embargo, and it's going to hurt America as much as it hurts China. So he's talking about at least resume some trade at least. So reduce the tariffs to an acceptable level that at least part of the trade can still happen. And I think they're probably talking about 30 to 50% tariff rates right now. And at that level, there's still some trade happening. And then building on this, then we can talk about maybe negotiating a trade deal, which I think, Donald Trump said it's going to take maybe 2 years to negotiate. At least I think it's going to take months to negotiate this. But I think, the American retailers, exporters in China, they cannot wait for 2 years. They have to be, this thing has to be resumed. The ships, the containers has to go to the United States coming back. Things have to be, the Christmas is going to be around the corner very soon. So I don't think it's going to be a nice scene that the kids that don't see these, Christmas gifts getting into November. So I think, so that's what they're talking about. They want to resume trade right now. That's their objective for this talk in Switzerland, I think over this weekend.
Part of what Trump has talked about for a long time, even in his first administration, his first campaign, was bringing back manufacturing jobs to the United States. Right. A lot of American economists point out just how silly it is that anyone would think that you could bring back a strong manufacturing base or establish a new manufacturing base for 2025 onward with tech and everything like this, high tech, just by simply initiating a tariff war of this sort. How did China develop their manufacturing superpower How long did it take, and kind of what were the main policies from the Communist Party of China that led to this success?
Well, I think in economics, actually, there are people studying this. Okay, yeah, there's a branch of economics called economic geography, talking about the historic migration of manufacturing clustering. Migrate from Europe to across the Atlantic to North America, from North America to Northeast Asian countries, and then to China. And it's not going to stay in China forever, in my view. So there's actually underlying economic forces at work. Some of the things I can mention, for example, is that you need to have a low labor cost. You have abundant supply of migrant rural labor potentially being transformed into industrial workers. You need a very good education system to crank out, STEM engineers, STEM people. You need a very large market to support the development of various branches of the industrial base. So China is actually in a very unique position. I mean, if you think about the kind of conditions I talk about, there are not many countries are like that in the world, and China happens to be that way, right? And also, I want to make a point that the narrative in Washington is that because these companies move to China, America end up in this very pathetic position. We don't have manufacturing anymore. I actually don't buy this narrative at all, and I can give you some examples. You look at the UK. UK was also deindustrialized. In that deindustrialized process, there was actually no China at play at all, right? And as a matter of fact, those companies who migrated out of the United States come to China to do manufacturing are actually being saved, in my view. I mean, if they were just like the UK example, many American companies will be just dead, and they don't have any manufacturing in the United States right now. You look at the auto industry. The UK used to be the world's strongest auto industry, right? I mean, you have these auto brands in the United Kingdom. They're all gone now. They don't have any manufacturing of automobiles in the UK. At least in America, they have Ford, they have Tesla, they have GM operating here in China. So I think, first of all, they are comparing to a false narrative, a false counterfactual. They're comparing to a false counterfactual that could have never happened. And even happened, it's even worse than they imagine. I think that's the first thing I want to talk about. The second thing is that they're talking about, I mean, they're sort of having this religious belief in manufacturing. Remember they talk about a high school graduate as a manufacturing worker. He has a wife as a homemaker, raising 5 kids, each of them attending a Catholic school. This kind of a jobs, it's not going to come back like this anymore. I mean, Donald Trump thinks that industrial jobs come back to the United States. He has this kind of a family. No, it's not going to happen. Look at the wages of industrial workers in China. I mean, they don't have the luxury of the wife working as a homemaker at home and then 5 kids sent to the Catholic school. It's not going to happen. So the kind of manufacturing jobs they're talking about, it's phantom jobs. They're living a fairy tale, in my view. It's never going to be like this. If ever American companies move their manufacturing back to the United States, it's going to be an entirely different kind of manufacturing. It's not going to create many jobs. It's going to highly automate their operation, in my view. So, again, that's another counterfactual they're talking about. Donald Trump promised to the American people that manufacturing jobs coming back to the United States. All these people in Ohio, in Illinois, Indiana, with high school degrees, all of a sudden have jobs that can live very comfortably. It's just not going to happen like that. Another thing I want to mention is that why America is so much fixated on manufacturing, industrialized, having industrialized base. This has a lot to do with America's defense industry. They understand very well that without manufacturing, there will not be, sort of manufacturing-related innovations, and that have a huge implication on the defense industry. So if a country is always thinking about starting the next war, of course they're going to be concerned about the defense industrial status. Of course they're going to be concerned about manufacturing base. I think this is what Washington is coming from. And I don't think they want to tell this story to the American people.
Well, it all lines up. If you read the Harvard drafted plan behind Trump's trade war, supposedly, they talk about this, the supply chains and making sure that they are brought home as a means to secure defense technology. And you also see that, I think, in Trump's $1 trillion floated plan for a new military budget.
I tell you what, it's not going to be sustainable. I mean, America, the IRS collects $4.8 trillion, okay? Now, out of that $4.8 trillion a year, $1.15 to $1.2 trillion is going to pay interest. And I think that number is going to increase even more. And then you put another $1 trillion of defense budget. Just like half of this gone. And we when we talk about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, right? And then discretionary planning, spendings on, this department, that department. America is not going to be able to support a $1 trillion defense budget for very long, in my view. This is just unsustainable, definitely unsustainable. They're going to run out of money. And the interest payment is all of a sudden you see this interest payments going to shoot up very quickly, and it's going to kill their budget. So I think Donald Trump realized this problem. That's why he is having the DOGE department to cut budgets. But the problem is that it's only cutting budgets out of one quarter of the Uncle Sam's budget. So real savings probably less than $100 billion. It's not going to address this whole issue. I think America needs to have a drastic cuts in these expenditures, particularly the defense. It can't sustain $1 trillion anymore.
America's got many problems, but the highly financialized market, running in tandem with basically a service economy, it really doesn't produce anything anymore, and we seem to have lost whatever means of economic might that we used to have. You also mentioned the issue of debt and the interest on our debt and how much we are paying on that. It's insane. What do you think could possibly be done to alleviate some of these issues in America's economy at this moment in time? And do you think America could potentially look to China for some of these issues, even though they're very different countries with very different, economic histories? But do you think we could learn anything from China?
Well, I think, starting from Washington's perspective, I totally understand what the Trump team is coming from. They realize a serious problem and something has to be done. Now, the problem is that, they believe in a shock therapy. And, historically, shock therapy never works, right? Never works. And I think, this kind of a abrupt policy without, clear understanding of consequences and how to do this, it's just going to, lead to a disastrous social experiment, essentially. I think the right way to do this is to have a evolution. I mean, what he's doing is essentially a revolution. He called it a common sense revolution. Come on, revolution never works in my view. You need to have an evolutionary approach, right? To start change things slowly, and do experiments first, and then if it works, we Chinese have a saying, Mr. Deng Xiaoping has a saying, crossing the river by touching the stones. He's not touching the stones. He just want to go ahead and cross the river, and he's going to be swamped in my view. So I think the way to do this is to have an evolutionary approach. Another thing I think is that on the trade side, there could be better ways of doing this, and I totally agree that China and the United States should be engaged in a negotiation to address this long-term chronic trade deficit problem slowly over time, and this can be addressed by not so much cutting back China's exports to the United States, but by increasing Americans' exports to China. I think there are still very complementary economies and working with each other. Now the problem is that this has to do with America's sort of hegemonic mindset. It doesn't want to see China being prosperous down the road. As a matter of fact, if you read Stephen Marin's paper, he talked about this a Triffin equilibrium problem, right?
Mhm.
And the problem is that America wants the best of the both worlds. On the one hand, it wants to have a hegemon. It wants to have a dollar hegemon. On the other hand, he can't avoid the problem of this creating a totally highly overvalued dollar that incentivizes American industries, American companies moving out of the country, not addressing the deficit problem. I think the solution is very simple. Don't resort to tariffs. Talk to China, have a trade agreement, and accept the fact that RMB and some other foreign currencies like the British pound, Japanese yen are also going to be playing an increasingly important role in the total global system. This is actually not so much against America's interest if we read Stephen Martin's paper carefully, actually. But Washington is very difficult to accept that mindset that this just cannot happen, right? I mean, the dollar is the dominant currency in the world, and that's a symbol essentially of America's supremacy around the world. So I think that's the dilemma Washington is facing. It's very difficult to change their mind at this point. They historically, I think that people in the United States understand that this direction is leading nowhere, but the empire is still going to head that way, and it's very difficult to change America's direction.
The Trifim dilemma you brought up, as you mentioned, was something that was talked about quite a bit in this paper that guided this policy. China, as I understand, one of the first measures they took was dropping off $50 billion worth of U.S. bonds and limiting the purchase of further U.S. bonds from Chinese banks. Do you think that this was all a part of the plan, so to speak? Do you think that there was any success achieved here in terms of slightly cooling the dollar?
I don't think there's a really serious strategic plan of doing this at this point. I don't see any evidence of doing that right now. I think there are some studies of pointing out that essentially the Chinese government controls about $1.8 trillion of 1.8, maybe $2 trillion of U.S. Treasury bonds market. That's still a quite small percentage. I don't think it's going to move the market dramatically. I mean, it's going to have some impact. It's not going to move directly. Now, that 1.8 or $2 trillion, some of it is China's direct purchase of treasury bonds. Actually, a much larger percentage is actually going through these trust funds based in Europe. But in total, it's about $1.8 trillion to $2 trillion. But I think the Japanese prime minister has a very interesting idea. He realizes, I mean, I think it's quite interesting to see that he is acting a lot more strongly than people would anticipate. And I think he mentioned this tool essentially, right? And I think if China and Japan work together to sell bonds, all of a sudden, that's going to have a huge spike in the yields of the bonds, treasury bonds, and I think that's going to move the market. I think combining both countries, probably 20%. I think about 20% of the total treasury market, and that's a big percentage. I think the very fact that he actually suggests this idea is fascinating in my view. But so far, I haven't seen any evidence that both countries are indeed working in that direction. That would be really economic warfare in my view, right? And it's not going to be good for anyone.
One last question for you. There has been some big news and also some speculation about the news. When China announced that they were going to be limiting the purchase of U.S. dollar bonds, treasury bonds, there were reports, I don't know how true this is, but there were reports of some big whales buying up European bonds. And then we saw news, it kind of was going up and down. It looked like the debates about whether or not this was going to happen. But ultimately, I've seen these reports that China and Europe have dropped some of the major restrictions for trade.
Yeah.
Is this a new opening for China now that the U.S. has chosen to play the adversarial role? They say, okay, well, we'll look closer to Europe and see what we can do here.
Yeah, what you're referring to is actually China and Europe's lifting of sanctions against some politicians in the European Parliament, and European lift some sanctions against Chinese government officials. Yeah, so this is definitely a major development in my view. I think China and Europe used to have a very close relationship, and I think what has been changing that over the last 3 years is really this issue in Ukraine. I think this is a major issue. Even though I don't buy into the theory that China is entirely on the Russian side. I think you look at the drones flying on the Ukrainian side. A lot of them actually coming from China. And I don't think the Chinese government doesn't understand all these drones. The very fact that it still allows that trade shows that China is actually taking a fairly neutral position on this. As a matter of fact, my understanding is that Moscow isn't very happy about this. But nevertheless, we had a problem with Europeans. But I think what Trump has done is to really drive the two sides much closer. I mean, the European side and China side. Europe understands that America is not reliable. I mean, you look at how Washington treats Ukraine, right? I mean, you look at this mineral deal here. I mean, it's just pathetic to me. They spent $120 billion, as Zelensky is saying. Donald Trump is, $350 billion. And by the way, that's not a grant. That's the money you have to pay back. I mean, the way it treats Kyiv serves as a good example of how you will be treated as America's close ally in the future. And I think everybody knows Kissinger's very famous saying about being fatal as an American friend. And I think Europe understands that. And I think that's why it is does not view China as a sort of a threat or as a big challenge anymore. In a sense, at least, it can something that can leverage off. So I think this is actually a very good development from Beijing's perspective. And particularly going back to the first issue that I talked about when we started this conversation, that is regarding Donald Trump's plan to entirely dismantle this rules-based international order. At least I think the European side and China side do have a common interest to at least defend this system. We don't want to go back to the days before the First World War. And it essentially is becoming a jungle. Europe has interest to have a international order here, and so does China. So I think at least on this issue, both sides have common interests. Immediate example is WTO. I'm pretty sure Donald Trump doesn't want to pay dues anymore for the WTO. WTO, whether it's going to be in existence or not in the next half a year, well, at least I think China and the European side are very adamant about keeping this organization. If in the absence of that, this organization would be gone. And then you have other international organizations gone as well. That's a domino effect. But at least I think Europe and China, they want to fight for this. So this is actually a very good development.
Dr. Gong, thank you so much for your terrific insight. It's a very complex set of issues. So I thank you for bringing the facts and helping us break it all down. Where can people follow along with your work online if they want to stay up to date with your analysis and your writings moving forward?
I don't actually do much writing. I mean, if you do some Google, I used to write a lot of OPED articles, but not so much for the last 2 or 3 years. I've been doing more and more the podcasting, this kind of interview thing. Yeah, but if you just do search, I've written plenty of OPED articles in the past, and I hope I will resume that habit again in the future. But nice to be on your show, and love to be on your show again in the future.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jackson. Hope to see you again.